It was a Saturday afternoon in Constantinople, July 16, 1054. A service was about to begin in the Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom, the largest building in the Christian world. Its dome so vast that 6th century worshippers believed it was suspended from heaven by a golden chain. The candles were lit, the clergy were assembled, the liturgy was beginning. And then 3 men walked in who had not come to pray. Cardinal Humbert of Silva Candida, legate of the Roman Pope, led them up the central aisle, past the altar screen, into the sanctuary itself, and placed a parchment document on the high altar. He turned and walked back out. As he passed through the great western doors, he shook the dust from his feet. A deacon ran after him into the street, begging him to take it back. Humbert refused. The document fell in the road. What that parchment contained was a declaration of excommunication against Patriarch Michael I Cyrillarius of Constantinople, a formal severing of communion, signed in the name of Pope Leo IX. Within 4 days, Cyrillarius convened his own council and excommunicated the papal legates in return. And that moment, that exchange of documents, that shaking of dust, that afternoon in the Hagia Sophia is almost universally described as the beginning of the Great Schism, the day Christianity divided into East and West, the birth of Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy as distinct entities. Here is the first thing almost no one tells you. That story is wrong, or at least profoundly incomplete. The real question, the one that unlocks everything else about this split, is not what happened in 1054. It is why a church that had survived 3 centuries of persecution, multiple waves of heresy, 4 major councils, and the collapse of the Roman Empire could not survive a disagreement between 2 difficult men. The answer is that it didn't happen in 1054. It had been happening for 250 years, and the wounds that made it permanent were not inflicted in the Hagia Sophia that afternoon. They were inflicted in a crusade 150 years later by soldiers who called themselves Christian. To understand all of that, we have to go back much further than most people think. The Greek word at the center of the story is schisma. It means a tear, a rending, a split in a piece of fabric. The New Testament uses it in 1 Corinthians 12 verse 25 to describe the kind of division that threatens to destroy the body, the kind of fracture that happens not along the surface but through the core. What happened between Rome and Constantinople was a schisma in precisely that sense. Not a clean break at a single moment, a tearing, slow, ragged, and deep. The tear begins, if we have to name a starting point, with a building. In 330 AD, Emperor Constantine moved the capital of the Roman Empire from Rome to a city on the Bosphorus he named after himself, Constantinople, New Rome. The implication was deliberate. This was not a branch office. This was the center of gravity shifting east. Within 2 generations, the old Western Empire was crumbling. By 476, it had collapsed entirely. The Bishop of Rome, the Pope, was left as the most powerful figure in Western Europe, presiding over a church whose political context had been gutted, and whose language was Latin, whose theology ran through Augustine of Hippo, and whose nearest surviving empire was 1,200 kilometers to the east, spoke Greek, ran through the Cappadocian Fathers, and believed it was the unbroken continuation of Rome. 2 halves of what had once been one, already speaking different languages, already developing different liturgical customs, already beginning to read the same scripture through different philosophical frameworks, already invisibly tearing. The theological fault line that would eventually split the church is contained in 2 Latin words, filioque and the Son. The Nicene Creed, the great declaration of Christian faith hammered out at the Council of Nicaea in 325, and expanded at Constantinople in 381, contained a single phrase about the Holy Spirit, that the Spirit proceeds from the Father. Full stop. That was the agreed language of the universal church. In 589, at a regional council in Toledo, Spain, the Western bishops added 2 words to that phrase. The Spirit proceeds from the Father and from the Son, filioque. The addition was made for a specific local reason. Visigothic Spain had recently converted from Arianism, and the bishops wanted to nail down the co-equal divinity of the Son beyond any possible Arian reinterpretation. What they did not do was ask anyone in the East. The addition spread quietly through the Western Church over the following centuries. The Frankish Church adopted it. Charlemagne's theologians promoted it. It drifted into liturgical practice across Latin Christianity, everywhere. That is, except Rome itself, which resisted it for 2 centuries. When Patriarch Photius of Constantinople encountered it in the 9th century, seeing Frankish missionaries in Bulgaria teaching a creed that differed from the one agreed by the ecumenical councils, He wrote an encyclical to the Eastern Patriarchs in 867. That remains one of the sharpest documents in the history of doctrine. Photius was not merely a churchman. He was, by wide agreement, the most learned man in the Byzantine world of his era, a scholar whose encyclopedic knowledge of ancient literature, philosophy, and theology was unmatched. When he condemned the filioque, he was not being provincial. He was making a precise theological argument. The question was not a trivial one about punctuation. It was about how you understand the eternal relationships within the Trinity. If the Spirit proceeds from the Father alone, then the Father is the single source and principle of divinity, the monarchy of the Godhead, as the Greek theologians called it. If the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son together, then there are, in some sense, two principles, two sources. The East believed this subtly disrupted the entire Trinitarian architecture, but there was a second objection Photius raised that the East never let go. Even if the theology was sound, even if filioque correctly described eternal Trinitarian reality, the West had no authority to alter the creed of an ecumenical council without calling another ecumenical council. The Council of Ephesus in 431 had explicitly forbidden adding to or subtracting from the Nicene formulation. The West had not merely introduced a disputed theological claim, it had unilaterally rewritten the common charter of the universal church. That is a different kind of offense. One is a disagreement about doctrine. The other is a claim about who has the right to define doctrine. And it is that second question, who has final authority over the church's teaching, that runs underneath every dispute in this story. Here is what most accounts of the Great Schism leave out. There was a schism before the schism. The Photian controversy of the 860s is sometimes dismissed in Western accounts as a minor episode, resolved and forgotten. This is misleading. What happened in that decade was a full-scale rupture between Rome and Constantinople. Mutual excommunications, competing councils, and the first formal Eastern condemnation of the filioque. That was only patched over through diplomatic necessity, not genuine resolution. Photius had been appointed Patriarch of Constantinople in 858, elevated rapidly from layman to bishop in circumstances. That gave Pope Nicholas I grounds to object. Nicholas, one of the most assertive popes of the entire medieval period, a man who understood papal authority as something universal and not merely Western, rejected the appointment and excommunicated Photius. Photius responded in 867 by summoning a council that declared Nicholas deposed. The standoff ended as Byzantine politics often did, through violence. A new emperor murdered the old one, reversed the appointments, reinstated his preferred patriarch, and sent conciliatory letters to Rome. The crisis technically resolved, but what it had exposed was the fundamental disagreement that the surface settlement did not touch. Nicholas believed the Bishop of Rome held monarchical authority over every bishop in Christendom, East and West alike. The Patriarch of Constantinople answered to no one, but a general council. Two entirely different ecclesiologies, two entirely different visions of what the Church even was. The word from which we derive ecclesiastical is the Greek ekklesia, the gathered assembly. But whose assembly? Who convened it? Who spoke for it? Rome's answer and Constantinople's answer were not compatible, and after the Photian controversy, both sides knew it. Charlemagne made it worse, in ways that echoed for centuries. On Christmas Day, 800, Pope Leo III placed a crown on the head of the Frankish king in St. Peter's Basilica, and proclaimed him Emperor of the Romans. The move shocked Charlemagne himself. He was said to have been furious, not wanting to appear to receive his authority from the Pope. But the political damage was done. Constantinople already regarded itself as the only legitimate continuation of the Roman Empire. There was one emperor, and he sat in the East. What the Pope had done was not merely coronate a Western king. He had declared the existence of a rival Rome. The Byzantine court refused to recognize the title. After years of wary negotiation, Emperor Michael I acknowledged Charlemagne's imperial dignity in 812, but pointedly did not call him Emperor of the Romans. That title belonged to Constantinople alone. Two emperors, two Romes, two centers of Christian civilization, each of which believed the other was, at best, a regional variation of something universal it alone possessed. The Charlemagne coronation accelerated something else as well. It deepened the papacy's sense that it stood above all political authority, that popes made emperors, not the reverse. The Eastern Church had lived for centuries within a model where the emperor and the patriarch governed together, a relationship the Byzantines called symphonia, harmony. The West was developing a model where the pope stood above the emperor entirely. These were not merely different administrative arrangements. They reflected genuinely different theologies of authority, power, and the relationship between heaven and earth. By the mid-11th century, the accumulated weight of all this, the filioque, the Photian wounds, the rival empires, the competing ecclesiologies, the different liturgical languages and practices, had produced two churches that shared a creed but increasingly little else. Into this environment came two men whose personalities were almost perfectly designed to make a difficult situation irreparable. Michael Cerularius became Patriarch of Constantinople in 1043. He had originally trained for a political career, not a church. And he brought a politician's instinct for provocation and a politician's conviction that conflict was a tool to be wielded. He was not a careful theologian, he was a power broker, and in 1053 he made the opening move that initiated the final crisis. He ordered the closure of all Latin Rite churches in Constantinople. The Latin churches in the city had been operating for years with their own liturgical customs, using unleavened bread for the Eucharist, among other things, rather than the leavened bread the Eastern Church used. Cerularius chose to treat this as heresy and closed them. He then wrote to the Pope, listing a catalogue of Western errors. The tone was aggressive to the point of contempt. The Pope who received that letter was Leo IX, a reformer, a man of genuine personal holiness, committed to renewing the Western Church's integrity. But he delegated the response to the worst possible choice. Cardinal Humbert of Silva Candida was the most intellectually aggressive churchman in Rome, a man who had spent years arguing that the papacy held universal sovereignty over all Christianity. He was also, as the Byzantine theologians he encountered quickly discovered, not entirely sure what he was talking about in several areas of Eastern theology. He arrived in Constantinople not to negotiate, but to demand submission. The two men, Cerularius and Humbert, never actually met. Cerularius refused to receive the legates. Humbert wrote increasingly intemperate tracts, attacking Eastern theology and practice. The Emperor Constantine IX, who genuinely wanted a political alliance with Rome against the Normans threatening southern Italy, tried desperately to broker a meeting and was ignored by both sides. Then Pope Leo IX died, on April 16, 1054, while the negotiations were still failing. Humbert's authority as papal legate technically ceased at that moment. But he stayed in Constantinople anyway, and on the 16th of July he walked into the Hagia Sophia during the Divine Liturgy and placed the document on the altar. The excommunication he issued was not, technically speaking, valid. Its author's commission had expired 3 months earlier. Contemporary historians largely ignored the events of 1054 as a minor diplomatic incident. A deacon ran into the street after Humbert and begged him to take the document back. He refused, shook the dust from his feet, and left. Here is where I want to take a position, because this is the part of the story that most treatments get wrong. The common telling presents 1054 as a tragedy of mutual pride, two stubborn men who failed to find a compromise. That was within reach. The implication is that better diplomats or men of greater personal humility could have prevented the split. I think this is too comfortable, too forgiving, and too historically shallow. The disagreements between East and West were not primarily about the personalities of Humbert and Cerularius. They were about two genuinely incompatible visions of what the Church was, who could speak for it, and what it meant to be faithful to the councils that had defined the Christian faith. On the filioque, the Eastern objection was not pedantic. If the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son equally, you have, in the view of theologians like Gregory Palamas and John of Damascus, subtly destabilized the divine monarchy, the fundamental Trinitarian order in which the Father is the source, fountain, and principle of divinity. This is not a trivial difference. This is about the shape of God, on papal authority. The Eastern Church had always understood Rome's primacy as a primacy of honor, of seniority among equals. The bishops of Alexandria, Antioch, Jerusalem, and Constantinople all shared in apostolic authority. No single bishop could define doctrine alone. Even the great Pope Gregory I, in the year 600, had protested angrily when the Patriarch of Constantinople tried to take the title of ecumenical patriarch, universal bishop, on the grounds that any bishop claiming universal jurisdiction was making himself equal to the Antichrist. Within a century and a half, popes were claiming exactly that title for themselves. The East was not being obstructionist, it was holding to what the councils had actually said. Rome had genuinely changed the terms. Where I believe both sides failed was not in their theology, but in their ecclesiology, their understanding of what to do when two members of the body fundamentally disagree. The answer the tradition had always given was a council. Call the bishops together, argue it out, let the Spirit speak through the assembled church. That never happened. Not in the 9th century. Not in the 11th. Both sides had by that point developed too much investment in their own position to risk a council they might lose. If 1054 was the cut, 1081 through 1204 was the infection that made it mortal. The First Crusade was launched in 1095. At that point, 41 years after the mutual excommunications, Catholic and Orthodox bishops were still corresponding, still attending each other's liturgies in some places, still uncertain whether the split of 1054 was truly permanent. The Crusaders who marched through Byzantine territory on their way to Jerusalem created enormous friction, but the fundamental relationship, however strained, remained. The Fourth Crusade destroyed it. In 1204, Crusaders who had set out ostensibly to recapture Jerusalem instead, through a series of political miscalculations, financial pressures, and opportunistic decisions, turned on Constantinople itself. They sacked it. 3 days of looting. The Hagia Sophia stripped, the altar broken up for its silver, libraries burned, icons smashed, the tombs of the emperors violated. The Crusaders installed their own Latin emperor on the Byzantine throne, and their own Latin patriarch in the Hagia Sophia. Pope Innocent III, who had launched the crusade, condemned the sack when he heard of it. He wrote furiously to the crusade leaders, describing their actions as shameful. But the damage was not undone. The theological and institutional wounds of 1054 might, conceivably, have been healed given sufficient time and sufficient goodwill. What happened in 1204 was a different kind of wound entirely. Greek Orthodox Christians had been killed, their holiest spaces desecrated, by men who called themselves brothers in Christ and wore the cross. The historian Timothy Ware, one of the 20th century's most careful scholars of Orthodox Christianity, wrote that even as late as 1095, ordinary Christians in East and West were largely unaware of any great gulf between them. After 1204, no Byzantine Christian was unaware. The memory of the Latin sack of Constantinople was not a theological abstraction. It was something people whose grandparents had survived it passed down to children, who would never forget it. When Mehmed II's Ottoman forces took Constantinople in 1453, 2.5 centuries after the sack, some Byzantine bishops had already concluded they preferred Ottoman rule to renewed subjection to Rome. The Fourth Crusade had made a kind of peace unimaginable, that might otherwise have been possible. The theological divide between East and West did not stop at the filioque. In the centuries after the Schism, the two traditions developed in genuinely different directions, and understanding those differences helps explain why, even after the diplomatic wounds are addressed, reunion remains elusive. Western theology, particularly from the 12th century onward, was shaped by scholasticism, the rigorous application of Aristotelian logic to theological questions, reaching its peak in Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century. God's essence and God's existence were increasingly treated as proper subjects for philosophical analysis. Eastern theology took a different path, associated above all with Gregory Palamas, a 14th century Archbishop of Thessalonica, who articulated what became the definitive Orthodox position on what it means to know God. Palamas drew a distinction that Western theology has never fully accepted, between God's essence, which is entirely unknowable and inaccessible to creatures, and God's energies, the uncreated divine light and life through which God genuinely communicates himself to creation, without ceasing to be transcendent. For Palamas, you do not merely think about God, you participate in God. The Hesychast tradition of contemplative prayer, stillness, interior silence, attention to the divine presence, was not a technique for producing mystical states. It was an encounter with the genuine, uncreated light of God's own life. Western theology largely rejected the distinction, arguing that it introduced an inappropriate division into divine simplicity. This is not a peripheral disagreement. It shapes everything downstream: what prayer is, what sacraments do, what salvation means, what the resurrection body will be. Two trees grown from the same seed, in the same soil, but shaped by 1,500 years of different weather. In 1965, Pope Paul VI and Patriarch Athenagoras I did something that required considerable courage. On December the 7th of that year, simultaneously in Rome and Istanbul, they read aloud a joint declaration that removed the mutual excommunications of 1054 from the memory of the Church, not lifting the schism, not restoring communion, but acknowledging that what happened that July afternoon had been, on both sides, driven by offensive words, reproaches without foundation, and reprehensible gestures. They committed the anathemas, in the language of the declaration, to oblivion. It was a gesture. No one pretended otherwise. The filioque is still in the Western Creed. The question of papal authority is no closer to resolution. The deep theological differences over divine essence and divine energies, over the shape of Trinitarian theology, over what the Church is and who can speak for it. None of those were touched, but the gesture mattered because of what it acknowledged. That the split of 1054 was not simply one side being right and one side being wrong, it was a failure of the whole body to remain in the love, that the body is meant to embody. John 17 verse 21. That they may all be one as you, Father, are in me, and I in you. The prayer Jesus prayed the night before he was crucified was not a prayer for doctrinal uniformity. It was a prayer that the world might see something in the Church that would make the world believe. Unity as witness. There is a reason the schism, and all the subsequent fractures of Christianity, carries a cost that no theological victory on either side can offset. A divided body is a diminished witness. Every time the Church uses the language of Christ to justify contempt for another expression of the faith in Christ, it answers the prayer of Gethsemane with something that sounds a great deal like its opposite. So what do we make of this? 1,000 years on, the Eastern Orthodox churches and the Roman Catholic Church have continued their dialogue. Theological commissions have met. Documents have been signed. The mutual excommunications have been lifted. Pope Francis and Patriarch Bartholomew I have met, prayed together, and expressed genuine mutual regard. In December 2025, the 60th anniversary of the lifting of the anathemas was commemorated with solemnity in both Rome and Istanbul. And still they do not share communion. Still, a Catholic cannot receive the Eucharist at an Orthodox altar, and an Orthodox Christian cannot receive at a Catholic one. The question of whether full reunion is possible, whether the 1,500 years of separate theological development, the different understandings of authority, the different views of how God communicates himself to creation, can be genuinely reconciled without either tradition abandoning something it believes is true, is not a question anyone should answer quickly. Some theologians on both sides believe that the filioque is genuinely compatible with Eastern Trinitarian theology if properly understood, that the apparent difference is partly a difference of emphasis rather than substance. Others believe the difference is real and significant, and that resolving it would require one side to concede something it cannot concede without being unfaithful to what it has received. My own view, and I hold it with appropriate tentativeness, is that the filioque itself is not the permanent obstacle. There is enough theological flexibility on both sides for a resolution to be imaginable. What is harder to resolve is the question of authority. Not because the Eastern position is obviously correct and the Western position obviously wrong, but because both positions have genuine scriptural and patristic support, and because neither tradition has, in the 11 centuries since Photius, developed a framework for what genuine reconciliation of those positions would actually look like. What makes the schism lastingly tragic is not that the questions are unanswerable, it is that the questions were never properly asked together. A body with a torn muscle does not heal by ignoring the tear, it heals by recovering the conditions that allow tissue to knit. Paul's image of the Church in 1 Corinthians 12, the body, one, with many parts, each necessary, none replaceable, was not written as poetry. It was written as diagnosis, and the body he was diagnosing was already beginning to fracture over the question of which gifts mattered most, which members were most important, which parts of the body could afford to ignore the rest. He answered the question by placing the love chapter directly in the middle of the argument about gifts, not as a consolation prize, but as the only possible answer to division. Without love, the gift of tongues is noise. Without love, the gift of prophecy is nothing. Without love, the Church with every theological gift is the Church with the most dysfunction. The Great Schism is, in the end, a case study in what happens when institutions that share a love for God lose the capacity to love across their differences. When the press of power and the protection of theological position become more urgent than the unity the Lord prayed for. The events of July 16, 1054 were not the cause of that failure, they were its symptom. Humbert's document fell in the street. A deacon ran after him, begging him to take it back. That unnamed deacon, whoever he was, Greek-speaking, living in the most magnificent city in the Christian world, watching a man shake the dust of the Hagia Sophia from his feet and walk away, may have understood something in that moment that the men with the titles and the authority did not. That what was falling in the street was not just a piece of parchment, that some things once dropped are very difficult to pick back up. The Church is still reaching for it. If this is a question you have wondered about, share this video with someone who has wondered the same thing. These are conversations the Church still needs to have. Script ends.